So no present in itself without past and future, and this applies to the others. Okay, this will have an interesting consequence in relation to the futurality of theory, or in relation to the, so to speak, in ordinary sociological language, the predictive powers of theory, simply because from then on, Derrida would begin to talk about future as the future to come. Okay, future to come would slightly different from our conceptualization of future, which is primarily based upon our conceiving of the present and past. Okay. However, future to come, according to Derrida, would something be indeterminate, yet having its traces in the present, so showing some of its indications, but not yet determined something. Okay. Derrida applied this concept, future to come, actually borrowed from Heidegger's conceptualization of Zukunft. Zukunft, as different from future, German term, was also translated as, in a sense, a certain future to come, okay? And related with Heideggerian conceptualization of the projecting of Dasein onto its own futurality, you know? Remember, Dasein was living ahead of itself, okay? So directing itself or projecting itself towards the future which has not yet been determined, okay? It was in that sense Derrida uses that notion, future to come. The French term for this, sometimes written together, sometimes with a dash in between, avenir. Out of which Derrida would generate in his later writings a certain kind of messianism without a messiah, as they call it, okay? Messiah, in Turkish, Mehdi, Mehdicilik. Okay? You know, Messiah is the one with his coming would save all of us as well as all of the world and existence in the grace of God, okay? Let's continue. An interval must separate the present from what it is not in order for the present to be itself. So again, he emphasizes the idea of difference. But this interval that constitutes it as present must, by the same token, divide the present in and of itself. Okay. Each interval, actually, he's talking about the theory of limits. Okay. Each interval generates another interval within itself, so to speak. Okay. Thereby also dividing among with the present everything that is thought on the basis of the present. So by this argument he shows that there is no such certain given present containing in it is unity, okay? The present itself divided into infinity, up to infinity, infinite number of the moments of the present, okay? That is, in our metaphysical language, every being, every singularly substance or the subject, okay? So it divides every substance and every subject as well, okay? In constituting itself, in dividing itself dynamically, this interval, what might be called spacing, the becoming space of time, or the becoming time of space, temporization. And it is this constitution of the present as an originary and irreducibly non-simple and therefore stricto sensu not originary synthesis of the marks or traces of retentions and protensions. to reproduce analogically and provisionally a phenomenological and transcendental language that soon will reveal itself to be inadequate, that I propose to call archae-writing. Okay? So Derrida was speaking of writing in that sense. Okay? It is nothing other than more or less distinguishable, identifiable, or systematized, more or less and for the most part. Okay? Systematized interplay of differences, so to speak. Architrace or difference. Okay? So these three terms are used synonymously, and actually Derrida comes closest to tell us what he was trying to mean when he was speaking, discussing, for instance, in his earlier work, when he was pushing forward the priority of writing rather than speaking. Okay, that was why it was important discussion. Okay, otherwise, well, somebody comes along and says that writing is much more important than speaking. Okay, but yeah, speaking is already there, and there is somebody strangely insisting that even speaking is based upon the possibility of writing. Okay, actually, by writing, he doesn't mean anything else than this originary, so to speak, but not the at the origin or beginning point. Okay, this originary, more or less systematic interplay of differences. Without that differences, okay, this interplay of difference, there won't be any possible. It won't be possible to neither speak or to write down, and no possible to produce meanings.
So he's stressing the significance of science, right? That's why writing.
No, not the significance of science, but rather the interplay of the science. Okay, the issue. Actually, what's at stake here is exactly the rejection of the pre-given existence of this science, or what structuralism called the positive terms. By positive, it has meant that these terms do exist. Okay. Positive stands here in relation to their essential, substantial, if you like, in itself existences. However, the critique of the presence in Derrida's language aims at exactly rejecting this point. They do not exist in themselves. That's the crack of the matter. They come into existence only and through being related with other, whatever they are, okay, with others. Okay. So what's at stake here is to emphasize the originary, not the original, but the originary character of this interplay of differences. Okay. And it is this interplay of differences which presents, so to speak, a ground upon which the entities, the signs of language, either they are emphasized as the signifiers or signifieds, and more than this, the things begin to make their appearance. Okay? Otherwise, they would not be able to hold themselves together if they were not related already with the others. Okay? So one, for instance, you can see, how can I put it? Not the same idea, but a similar idea in Hegel's discussion of the possibility of the individual, only and true in relation to the constitution of the society. Okay? Hegel would argue that that individual we are so much used to take for granted, for instance, Hegel would argue that cannot exist prior to the constitution of the society. And actually, in its contradistinction, it is being posed against the society, there comes that entity which we begin to call the individual. Okay, that's the basic problem. Actually, one of the applications. Okay, and usually in sociology we tend to take the pre-given existence of the individual, you know, for granted. You are there as individuals in front of me. I am an individual myself. Okay, But the argument is that the very possibility of constituting or conceiving myself as an individual separate from the rest, okay, involves that engagement with the rest, what I call rest in the prior statement, okay? And what I call the rest is the total sum of all of the other individuals, which is conceptualized in my thinking in the form of the concept of a society, okay? Now, when the concept of society makes its appearance, actually it is through this interplay of the individuation. And throughout this course we have seen how this has been applied in socio-historical analysis, say in the example of Michel Foucault, okay? The individuals, the subjects which are our own selves, okay, is nothing else the result of our being subjected to the exercise of power. The exercise of power is nothing else than being related to, or if you like, exposed to something which is not us. Okay, that's all. So my subjectivity, my modern subjectivity, or your own this or that subjectivity, whatever they are, or selfhood, whatever they are, even our prior to any constitution of certain subjectivity, even deprived of these socio-historical effects, what we tend to think as our own selves, so to speak, is nothing else than the produce of these interplay of relations. Okay? A relation can only be possible if there is a difference in the meantime. Okay? If there are no differences, one cannot relate with what one is not, so to speak. And the description of I am and I am not states exactly this difference, okay? I am here and I am not is over there, okay? And it is nothing else than that difference, actually. And what I am and what I am not is defined as a result of this interplay of difference, okay? They are not pre-given entities. I am standing here as coming out of nowhere in my own existence, and the world over there standing in its own existence, and we as our predetermined existences enter into relation. No, it's not that, okay? The argument is that as we relate with each other, we come to be what we are, okay? And when this relation ceases to continue, we lose what we are. In other words, in Aristotelian language, actually from the very beginning of our entrance into world, so to speak, from the very beginning of the process of our own coming to be, at the same time the process of passing away is already there, okay? So that what I am cannot remain stable throughout this process, okay? But always subject to change and subject to definitions and redefinitions, determinations and redeterminations in this historical flow of the events. Okay, that was the argument developed by Derrida in his early 1967, as far as I remember, article, okay, entitled Difference. Now I'm going to pass to another article, which I already mentioned in an earlier session, as I found it most important article or piece of writing. Actually, it's a speech given in 1989 in the United States, Johns Hopkins University. A strange article indeed, and I guess this article is very important to help us thinking about the relationship, our relationship of the law, which is so important, okay? Law turns out to be so important, or if you like, tradition turns out to be so important, if you like, what it was, established patterns, rules turns out to be so important, or if you like, in Derrida's theorizing of deconstruction, the established patterns of dichotomies developed within the Western tradition of thinking are so important. So deconstruction actually originates in Hegelian idea of the destruction of earlier thinking. Okay, but Hegel describes his destruction as not total annihilation, total negation of what has been thought or written down by earlier tradition, but however, developing a true critique of it and passing through it, producing a new effect. Actually, as we have seen, Derrida was exactly talking about this when he had introduced his idea of trace. He was talking about a certain transgression, okay? But the problem with transgression or novelty is that, okay, without the old or established pattern or the rule, there can't be no transgression or novelty, okay? So all possibility of introducing new does not come from the power of rejecting or annihilating all what has been passed previously, but rather passing through them, okay? So this deconstruction inspired by Hegel first and later on Heideggerian destruction, okay, does not imply a total negation on Derrida's part at least, okay? But it also implies a transgression of what has already been developed at the same time. And transgression can only be possible on the background of what has already been there. Okay? So, returning back to the article. The article has an interesting title. The title is Force of Law, the Mystical Foundation of Authority. Okay. Actually, seen from rather first glance, at the first glance, you may come to think that the article deals with the question of that very famous question of what they call political science as a question of obedience, you know, the mystical foundation of authority. You know, authority as a concept differentiates itself from force or power, sheer power, physical use of force, etc., by being related to another notion, the consent, you know, the willing consent of those upon which the authority has been exercised, okay? And in relation to power, there is no question of consent. In relation to concept of force, not in Nietzschean, but ordinary sense, forcing somebody, etc., okay? There is no problem of consent, but rather enforcement, etc., okay? So, the emphasis on authority refers to consent. Actually, the problem is this. Yeah, I am sure that you ask yourselves the same question several times in your lives, even though you are much younger than. Why do people obey such stupid rules? Huh? Why do we obey such stupid rules? Okay? Some of the rules, not all of the rules, I mean, some of the rules which come to us or to our understanding is really stupid, okay? Why do you obey this? Why do I obey these rules, etc.? This article appears to be asking that question, but rather, as we proceeded with it, enters into the burning question of that relationship between justice and law. Okay. Now, one of the most difficult issues, I know, justice. Everybody demands justice, okay? There's no problem with it, as well as everybody demands goodness and advocates justice and goodness. But the problem with these concepts is that everybody has different, conflicting, and even hostile conceptions of justice and goodness. What goodness is, what justice is, okay? The problem, and this constitutes the very basic problem at the heart of the Levinasian theory as well, you know. Levinas was advocating the establishment of an ethic of the neighbor, okay, especially for those who were suffering, okay, or disadvantaged, when the other, especially that suffering other, makes its appearance at the horizon of our sameness, he was saying, okay, the same here should necessarily feel itself as responsible to respond, okay. In other words, practically speaking, Levinas was introducing something which appears to be quite neglected in the tradition of thinking, okay. That humane, face-to-face, actual, practical relationship with that suffering other, say, the Syrian immigrants in Turkey, okay. So that suffering, what are we gonna do? And their presence here, their appearance in our own horizon here, bringing us, in that argument, an undeniable responsibility to say something, to do something about, okay? That was the basic question. And one can prefer, of course, not to look at that side of life, okay, and to look the other sides, but one knows, one cannot negate, one knows that they are there, and suffering all those children, etc. Remember those photographs of the children, for instance, those pictures of children taken at the seashore, sunken down into the deep waters of the Aegean Sea and so on. Okay, so Levinas was talking about all these actually, and reminding us that we are responsible before that being who is already suffering there, before our responsibility, as Heidegger would claim, with respect to the question of being. Okay. That was the crack of the argument, actually, and as you may remember, Levinas was the one who suffered a lot in the hands of the Nazis during the Second World War, losing almost all of the members of his extended family, only being able to save his wife and his daughter, okay? All being killed. So, another Jew here, Derrida, an Algerian Jew, actually, originally, okay? He was born in Algeria and belonging to a family of Jews living at least for 3 generations in Algeria, okay? An Algerian Jew, increasing in between these intervals, came to close. Actually, this Levinasian proximity had already been there in early 1960 writings, but came closer to Levinasian position later on. You know, the atmosphere of the 1960s were quite different. It was revolutionary, and as we have seen, the rejection of the possible subjectivities as given entities, for instance, the critique of subjectivity and the critique of modern thinking began in those years. Okay? So this critique, however, turned out to be quite destructive, and as we have seen in the examples of Foucault, Baudrillard, Levinas, and perhaps some others, okay, when you destroy everything, we began to discover that actually the destruction did not set us free, simply because inside what had been destroyed, there was no core at all. You know, we were saying, for instance, the whole critique began to liberate the human from the grip of that modern subjectivity and its totalizing effects. Remember 1961, title of the 1961 book written by Levinas, Totality and Infinity. Totality, encapsulating into one single oneness, in the oneness of the nation, for instance, in the autonomy of the individual, etc. And Levinas was pushing forward to break down this unity, to explode it into an infinity, okay? To open up that entity, whatever it is, a determined, strict entity, to the infinity of the possibilities of an unknown externality in the face of that other. Now, the scene is this for this article, okay? And here, within this scenery, Derrida is about to introduce that problematic relationship between justice and law. Why it's problematic? There are certain problems. First of all, actually, even though in the especially Anglo-Saxon tradition, which is later began to be termed as the positive school, okay, starting with Thomas Hobbes perhaps, okay, there began to be a current of thinking, okay, stating that law is nothing else than the positive dictates of the sovereign, who himself is not responsible for anything else or for anybody else. You know, sovereign comes along to be able to save us from that shitty state of nature in which we can produce nothing and in which we are in real danger. Okay, in contrast to this saving power of the sovereign, we individuals gave up a considerable portion of our freedoms, freedom to kill the other, freedom to disrespect other, etc., etc., okay, and enter into contractual relationships, okay. Such an understanding of law, as you can see, establishes or even refuses, okay, any connection whatsoever between the idea of justice and law, okay. So, Hobbes openly declares that laws have nothing to do with the problem of justice, okay? The law's primary function is to establish a dependable order in which contractual relationships could be able to develop, okay? However, in contradistinction to this, especially that Platonic tradition, which was so influential in continental Europe, is persisting in insisting on the importance of the connection between laws and justice. Okay. Actually, as you can see, this is one tries to limit the legal field into a certain formal legality, which has been described by Max Weber as the produce of the development of modernity or legal system of modernity in the pure formal, logical, legal forms. Okay? In other words, practically speaking, what's at stake is the development of the procedural law. Okay? Bizde ne deniyor buna? Usul kanunu. And turns out to be that procedural law turns out to be more important, actually the starting point of the exercise of law in the modern systems, therefore causing a certain neglect with regard to the question of the realization of justice. You know, I don't know, I don't care if I know this man is guilty or not. All I do care is that whether the evidence has been collected according to the appropriate procedures or not. Okay? If appropriate procedures, demands of the appropriate procedures have not been fulfilled, regardless of this man has committed that deed actually or not, okay, the law cannot condemn that man. Okay, that was the principle of the modern system of law, bringing forward the formal logical aspect. Okay, so procedure acquires a priority, so to speak. Therefore, neglecting the question of justice, and worse still, the very generality of the statements of law causes law to neglect to exercise justice for each and every particular case. For instance, I remember a case which caused me to write down my PhD thesis, as far as I remember, okay, where 3 young boys had been condemned 5 to 9 years imprisonment because of they entered into a sweetery shop, okay, and have eaten 2 tepsis of baklava. Okay. Now, in that case, the strange point was that all of the parties did agree that the punishment for this deed was too heavy, including the public prosecutor, including the judge, including the advocates of the children, including parents, including other members of the society, including members of the political parties, including the members of the press, all were agreed that the punishment that the court verdict with regard to the deed is not in proportion. You know, there are 3 children over there just playing or feeling a certain desire which they could not control, or following whatever urge you may imagine, okay, suddenly enter into a shop and eat down, still not to sell, okay, eat down a couple of kilos baklava. That's all. Any one of us can do the same, you know. And now condemning these children into imprisonment for 6, 9, 7 years, okay, would produce nothing but criminals out of these children, okay. So it's not for rehabilitation, it's meaningless, okay. The law is not just over there, showing that the generality of law actually cannot be applied in each and every case with the same degree of fairness, okay? Simply because the law, not knowing that they are the children, that they were playing among themselves, etc., describes a criminal act, okay? Breaching into a private property and destroying that property and stealing something out of it, okay? So, and the punishment for this, you know, is a very important punishment, most important punishment, group of most important punishments, simply because after transgressions against one's body, there comes the transgressions against one's property, okay? Therefore, the punishments are heavy, okay? So, however, law cannot do without being general, simply because it turns out to be impossible to enact a new law for the peculiarities and specificities of each and every case. Therefore, laws fall short with regard to the demand of their being just. Okay? There is a serious problem. Therefore, justice separates itself from the domain of law. Okay, and to a certain degree remains outside of it. But continental thinking insisted that, and I'm sure that you instinctually almost insist that laws should necessarily be just, in contradistinction to that Hobbesian tradition. Okay. Now, it is this problem. Now, first of all, Derrida enters this question, actually the title, The Mystical Foundation of Authority, the phrase belongs to Montesquieu himself, okay, in his book Laws. Derrida enters with the device of Montesquieu's discussion and Montesquieu's emphasis on the relationship, not with justice yet, but on the relationship between laws and the possibility of their enforcement, okay. So, for the law, prior to the question of its relationship with justice, simply because we all know that whatever position we assume in that previous discussion, whether the laws should be just or not, we all know that, okay? Regardless of its relationship with justice, there are laws. In other words, there are laws which we consider just, as well as there are laws which we consider as unjust. Okay? So, then the question of justice or their justness is not the major element of our discussion of law. But laws cannot be laws, as Montesquieu emphasizes in his discussions, okay, without their being capable of enforced. Okay? So enforcement turns out to be the crucial factor in the constitution of the law, in the coming into being of the law. Okay? So Derrida's article, by using Montesquieu's text, establishes a very intrinsic relationship between the notion of enforceability and the possibility of law. Actually, Derrida in its rather rare moments leaving behind French, speaks this term in English. And he says that there is no such corresponding term in French, okay? Law enforcement. I'm not sure if we have a corresponding term for this English phrase, law enforcement.
This is not the police, right? Because law enforcement is also police.
No, this is enforcement of the laws, involving police as well, of course. Okay, so involving policing as well as a distinct institution of law enforcement. While law enforcement as a concept cannot be limited only to policing. Okay, so Türkçe'de var mı öyle bir deyimimiz bizim?
Kanun zor oluyor mu? Kanun zor oluyor mu?
Olmuyor gibi sanki. Yani bu kanunu zorlamak gibi. Yani bizde kanunu uygulamak diyoruz herhalde, değil mi? Kanunu uygulamak diyoruz daha çok herhalde. Bilmiyorum. Okay. So this phrase brings together that hidden relationship, according to Derrida, the force or the possibility of being enforced and the possibility of law, okay? In other words, said rather briefly, laws cannot be laws without their being enforced, okay? However, this relationship, this intrinsic relationship between enforcement and laws produces certain difficulties which Derrida deals with in 4 statements taken from Blaise Pascal. Okay. The first statement, listen carefully, I'm not going to write them down on the board for the sake of the shortage of time. Okay. The first statement, Blaise Pascal was saying, justice, force. It is right that what is just should be followed. It is necessary that what is strongest should be followed. Okay, on the first statement, Blaise Pascal says that it is right, true to do, in other words, okay, right to do, to follow what is just, okay. In the second part of the phrase, however, he says it replaces this quality of being right, true to do, with the quality of necessity, and says that it's necessary to follow the strongest, okay, the one who has the most power. Okay, it is necessary to follow simply because the strongest turns out to be capable of enforcing whatever it is. Okay, so it makes it necessary. The strongest makes it necessary to follow what he says, in other words. But it is just, or it is right thing to do, to follow what is just at the same time. Actually, this statement establishing a problematic relationship between just and the necessity coming out of being enforced to do something. Okay? The second statement runs like this. Justice without force is powerless. Okay? And force without justice is tyrannical. Okay. Justice without force is powerless. So, whatever idea you may have in your mind with regard to what is just, okay, if you are not capable of enforcing it, okay, this would not mean anything at all. That's all, okay? So I think that such an organization of that society is just, or I think that just a simple rebuking of these children was just, rather than condemning to years of punishment, okay? But since I am powerless, I would not be able to exercise this idea of justice of mine onto the others, therefore it meant nothing for nobody, okay? But the powerful state, with its powerful laws, which it was capable of enforcing, came into the scenery and punished those children for years of punishment, okay? So justice without force is nothing, but force or power without justice is tyranny, okay? It is the second statement written by Pascal. Again, establishing a rather critical balance between justness of the laws and their enforceability. Okay, and therefore, it's necessary then to combine justice and force, and for this end make what's just strong, or what's strong just. Okay? This was the third statement by Pascal. It is necessary then to combine justice and force, okay? And for this end make what is just strong, and what's strong just. Okay? So justice without force is nothing. Force without justice is tyranny. To be able to save ourselves with this dilemma, it turns out to be necessary to make just strong and the strong just. Okay? And this fourth statement, and thus, being unable to make what is just strong, this fourth statement is quite interesting, so try to listen carefully. And thus, being unable to make what is just strong, we have made what is strong just. Let me read it once again. And thus, being unable to make what is just strong, we are not able to make those who defend justice the strongest party in the society. Okay? And therefore, due to this inability, we have made what is strong just. It's a rather, especially the second part, is a rather problematic expression.
So the power is legitimized.
Yeah, this is the mystical foundation of authority, actually. We have made what is strong just. This is an enigmatic expression. It may mean that after our many efforts, we indeed succeeded to take the strong onto the grounds of justice, on the one hand, but however, on the other hand, it may also mean that we came to accept what has been done by the strongest as justice. Actually, in this second interpretation, this part of the statement comes closer to what Nietzsche describes or discusses in relation to the problem of moral valuation. Remember, according to him, there was no intrinsic goods or bad. Okay? All the good and bad comes out of the very naming or definition of the master in relation to its own acts. Okay? I did this, this is good. Why? Because I did this. Okay? And I want this. I named this as bad. Why? Because I don't want this. Okay? So no intrinsic quality of the things, only they're being related with the judgment, evaluating judgment of the master. Things acquire or events acquire their moral quality, their values, so to speak. Okay? So if that second possibility is at stake, it means that we are forgetting about the notion of an intrinsic in itself justice, but making us ourselves prepared to accept what has been done by the strongest in the society as justice. Okay? The master, the strongest, naming what is good and what's bad, in other words. Okay? But in this moment, there occurs a certain strange thing in this impossibility, in this impasse between two interpretations. There occurs a certain happening which is described by Derrida, and actually he gives a lot of importance to this term, a certain aporia. And poria actually means in ancient Greek passage, okay, gateway, passage. Aporia, a being the negative prefix, okay? So, impassable passage. There is a passage there, but it turned out to be impossible to pass through, actually. Okay, so it has already usually been translated as the dilemma or sometimes paradox or difficulty in the translation of those philosophical texts. Okay, an impassable passage, a difficulty which is insurmountable but still remaining there. Okay, and this difficulty, this aporia, according to Derrida in this article, between justice and law. Okay. Laws should somehow be related with justice, but this is the passage part, but their relationship is not that easy and difficult. And the bringing or production of the laws can only depend upon that originary force, in which Derrida would describe as Gewalt. Originary force which through exercising itself established the foundation of a law, actually. And therefore, Derrida would interpret this as the founding violence. Gewalt is a strange term, German, okay, meaning both violence and the enforcement of law, okay. So, in the concept of Gewalt, which actually borrowed from Walter Benjamin's discussion of violence, okay, and located here at the heart of this text, okay, Gewalt functions as the moment of the unity of that groundless, so to speak, itself unlawful violence, which founds the law, okay? Actually, it is the moment of the introduction of the new law, or if you like, the moment of, as we have talked about earlier, the moment of a serious transgression with respect to the earlier established system of relations, okay? Bringing forth the establishment of a new law. But this happens, you know, this relationship, as we have seen, the ethical relationship, in other words, takes place in a social environment, not in isolation. Thinking can take place in isolation. Like Descartes, I may isolate myself in the darkness of one single room and begin to engage in thinking, etc. But ethical relation always requires the other. So the Levinasian scene is taking place between what Levinas calls the same, or we can call the self, and the other. So justice as one of the most important questions of this ethical, actually not one of the very most important question of this ethical relationship, therefore is about this social relationship, okay? Justice is not something related with my internal existence, okay? Justice is about how one entity relates with another entity in a social setting, okay? So the scenery is necessarily the scenery of the relationship of the same self and the other, okay? But the problem is that, as you may imagine, for instance, here in this situation, you can multiply the entities, doesn't make any difference, okay, as many as you like. The problem is that, okay, as you can see, each one of the entities here finding themselves in a social relationship would generate a certain conception of justice. And the strange point is that this generation of that certain conception of justice would take place, as it is a conception, would take place as a result of the interplay of the differences of the concepts, which are in their thinking, okay? So even though the concepts in their thinking cannot be separated from the larger ground, the social ground of a commonly shared language, it appears that especially in relation to those others which are suffering or underprivileged in a given social setting, okay, it turns out to be difficult to share the same language. So we can assume that even though some of the parties do share the same language and develop similar concepts of justice, okay, some others, especially who are the most critical ones, the suffering ones, okay, would develop different conceptions of justice. In sum, to make it rather simple, let's assume that this is the relationship between the self and the other. It practically means that this self's conception of justice cannot correspond to the conception of justice of the other. Why? Simply because if it was possible to correspond these two, okay, it would mean that the other is not there. The other is this one of the same. If you like, to put it in ordinary language, there wouldn't be no other, but all that there is would be a single unity of a V. Okay? So, since the other experiences that conditions in which we find ourselves, okay, in a rather different, and if you follow Levinas here, in a rather disadvantaged way, okay, their relationship with the situation would differ from our relationship with the situation. Therefore, their conception of justice would necessarily differ from our conception of justice. Okay? So this means that out of the language which is commonly shared but somehow experienced differently, there emerge two conceptions of justice. What do you say? Our time is up and over. Let's cut it here. Huh? Okay, let's continue a few more minutes. Two conception of justice. But the problem is that, you know, if you do not have power, if you are not the strongest, you will not be able to bring forth with justice. And another problem is that if you are not engaged in enforcing that justice that you have conceived, that justice, it would be nothing. Remember what Blaise Pascal was saying. Justice without force is nothing. Okay? So, and it is clear that the other here is the disadvantaged, which means the weaker party. It's the relationship with the same, which is the strongest party. Therefore, the other is not in the position of enforcing that justice, but only the same. So the same brings forth with his call for justice by putting a force behind it and creating what Derrida would call a performative, okay? Naming things and naming things in language in definite way and therefore producing results, so to speak, okay? These acts are crimes, these acts are not crimes, for instance. These acts are heavy crimes, these are acts of negligible crimes, etc., okay? Torts and so on. So I am defining things and I am, by this classification of things, producing effects. Okay? For instance, who says that beating somebody and taking 5 liras out of somebody should be worth of punishment of 20 years? Huh? And this is the case. Almost approximate to killing somebody, which is 24 years of punishment. Okay? I'm taking just 5 liras. Who says this? Okay? So, the powerful defines their relationships, okay? According to, but the problem is that, as you remember, Levinas talks about the responsibility on the shoulders of the same, okay? The same, therefore, should be responsible in this situation, not only of his own actions, but also all the actions of the others. Why? Simply because in the situation, the powerful, the strongest in Pascalian language is nothing else than but that same. okay? And that the other is the weaker party, okay? And the same, assuming this infinite responsibility in this relationship with the other, therefore, would call or would organize its call for justice not only for its own self, but primarily for the other, okay, in this schema. So we attribute all the good innocence and goodwill on the part of the same and say that the same is capable of formulating a conception of justice not only for its own self, but primarily and more importantly for the other. So the call for justice on the part of the same is not about its own self, okay? It's about bringing justice for the other. That's why we say we should help, for instance, those Syrian immigrants, okay? Refugee seekers, etc. Fine. However, for this call for justice to be justice in the proper sense, it has to be or needs to be enforced. And enforcement takes place where? In that social relationship. Now, the call for justice or concept for justice, even if it includes justice for the others, has been conceived within the structure of the same. And that call for justice now needs to be enforced simply. And enforcement of this justice constitutes that founding violence, okay? Bringing a tremendous differentiation in the name of justice in the prevailing system of law. In the prevailing system of law, where the same had been defined as the strongest party, where the other had been defined as the weakest party. Okay? So it brings a transgression with respect to the prevailing law, establishing the strongest and weakness of the parties in the social relationship. Okay? But here, the aporia operates in this exercise, enforcement of that originary idea of justice. However, the problem is that following this founding violence to establish the law, this is the breaching moment of the new law, but it needs to be protected at the same time, okay? So it transforms itself into maintaining violence. The police, law enforcement, I'm talking about exactly here, okay? I'm talking about a revolution, a founding violence, a throwing away of the older constitution with violence, not without violence, as we discussed the matter here in Turkey, okay, with violence, and the following violence is the maintaining violence. You know, if the founding violence is momentary and actually itself is illegal simply because all its legality can be established retrospectively. Under the light of the law it establishes, okay, not prior to that. Actually, in relation to the earlier law, it breaches, it transgresses, it's an illegal act, so to speak, that violence. But once it succeeds and establishes a new law, under the light of that law, it turns out to be, in a rather retrospective fashion, legal moment. The founding moment of the new legality, if you like, okay? And the rest is the transformation of this founding violence into maintaining violence in the form of the institutionalization of police and other apparatus of justice in the society. Okay? Fine, all right. But the problem is that here, when this originary call for justice for the other began to be connected with power, okay, and began to enforce it, where does it enforce it? The strange point. We are now at a very strange point. It enforces itself on the very relationship between the self and the other. Okay? In other words, it enforces itself onto the self as well as onto the other. Okay? So, if, for instance, what was demanded by the other was that justice, it would not need to enforce itself. But it appears that it necessarily needs to enforce itself, therefore transforming itself from being a call for justice into being a law. Okay? So losing its quality of being just at the same in the process of same transformation. Okay? This is the very interesting argumentation developed by Jacques Derrida in this very article, and I recommend you, if you are interested in matters of justice, legality, etc., it is a must. One has to simply read it. Okay, this brings me to the end of my discussions throughout this semester. I am sorry for keeping you here longer hours. So thank you all, okay?